Sister mocked her disabled brother. But on stage, he made everyone cry. Hi, everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the breakfast table where the Henderson family sat in their usual arrangement. Mom poured coffee with practiced efficiency. Dad buried his nose in the newspaper, and 17-year-old Sarah scrolled through her phone with the intensity of someone whose entire social universe existed within that glowing screen. And then there was Daniel. 14-year-old Daniel sat at the far end of the table, carefully spreading peanut butter on his toast with the deliberate movements that had become second nature to him. His cerebral palsy affected the left side of his body, making simple tasks require extra concentration, extra time. His left hand rested awkwardly in his lap, while his right hand did most of the work, a sight so familiar to the family that no one paid it any mind anymore. No one except Sarah, who glanced up from her phone long enough to roll her eyes. "Danny, you're getting crumbs everywhere again," she muttered, not bothering to look at him directly. Daniel's face flushed slightly, but he said nothing. He never said much at breakfast, or any time, really. His speech came slowly, words sometimes getting tangled on his tongue, and he'd learned early that silence was often easier than the struggle to be heard. "Sarah," their mother warned gently, "be kind to your brother." "I am being kind, Mom. I'm just saying he could be more careful." Sarah's voice carried that particular tone of teenage exasperation that suggested the entire world was conspiring to inconvenience her personally. Their father folded down a corner of his newspaper and looked at Sarah over his reading glasses. "Your brother is doing just fine. Maybe you could focus on your own breakfast instead of managing everyone else's." Sarah shrugged and returned to her phone, but not before shooting Daniel another look that made him shrink a little further into his chair. It was a look he knew well, the look that said he was an embarrassment, a problem to be managed, something that made her life more difficult just by existing. This was the daily rhythm of the Henderson household, small cruelties disguised as helpful observations, silence that spoke louder than words, and Daniel absorbing it all like a sponge that had long ago reached its saturation point. The real trouble always started at school. Daniel attended the same high school as Sarah, though he was 3 grades below her. The building was old and not particularly well equipped for students with mobility challenges, which meant Daniel often struggled with heavy doors, steep stairs, and crowded hallways. But he'd adapted, found his roots, made his accommodations. What he couldn't adapt to was his sister's active campaign to pretend he didn't exist. It wasn't that Sarah was openly cruel at school. She was too image-conscious for that. Instead, she employed a more sophisticated form of torture, complete and utter denial of their relationship. When friends asked if she knew that kid with the limp, she'd shrug and change the subject. When Daniel waved at her in the hallway, she'd look right through him. When teachers mentioned her younger brother in parent conferences, she'd find excuses to be anywhere else. The worst part wasn't the denial itself. It was the way Sarah's friends had learned to treat Daniel as a result. They'd adopted her attitude of polite dismissal, speaking about him as if he wasn't there, making jokes about special kids that weren't quite cruel enough to get them in trouble but were cutting enough to leave marks. Daniel felt every slight, absorbed every dismissal, carried the weight of being unwanted by the person who was supposed to love him most. But Daniel had a secret. Every day after school, while Sarah went to soccer practice or hung out with friends at the mall, Daniel would make his way to the school's old auditorium. The drama teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had given him permission to use the space for homework, though she suspected, correctly, that he was up to something more interesting than algebra. Daniel would climb onto the stage, position himself center stage under the ghost light that was always left burning, and transform. Here, Alone in the vast empty space, his limp didn't matter. His halting speech smoothed out when he was reading poetry or practicing monologues. His awkward movements became deliberate choices. On this stage, Daniel wasn't the disabled kid everyone had to accommodate or ignore. He was simply Daniel, full of dreams and words and feelings that demanded to be expressed. He'd been writing poetry since he was 10, filling notebook after notebook with verses about loneliness and hope, about feeling invisible and dreaming of being seen. His teachers had noticed his gift for language early on, but Daniel had learned to keep his writing private. Sharing meant risking ridicule, and he'd had enough of that to last several lifetimes. But lately, something had been stirring in Daniel's chest, a restless feeling that all his hidden words and secret dreams were building toward something. He couldn't shake the sense that he was meant for more than just surviving each day, more than just being tolerated by a family that saw him as a burden and ignored by a sister who was ashamed of his existence. The opportunity came in the form of a flyer posted on the school bulletin board. Annual Spring Talent Show. All students welcome to audition. Prizes awarded. Show your spirit. Daniel stared at the bright yellow paper for a long time, reading it over and over until he'd memorized every word. A talent show. A chance to step out of the shadows, to show everyone who he really was beneath the disability they couldn't see past. He tore off one of the small tabs at the bottom of the flyer with the audition information, his hand shaking slightly as he folded it and tucked it into his backpack. That evening at dinner, the family's conversation centered around Sarah's latest academic achievement. She'd been accepted to her first-choice college with a partial academic scholarship. The celebration felt forced to Daniel, like everyone was trying too hard to be excited, but he participated anyway, offering his congratulations in his careful, measured way. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart," their mother said, reaching across the table to squeeze Sarah's hand. "All your hard work is paying off." "Thanks, Mom. I just can't wait to start fresh somewhere new." Sarah's eyes flickered toward Daniel for just a moment, and he caught the unspoken meaning. Fresh, somewhere new, somewhere without the embarrassment of a disabled younger brother. "It'll be weird not having you around," their father said. "The house will feel empty." "Not that empty," Sarah replied with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Danny will still be here for years." The words stung, carrying the clear implication that Daniel was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. He pushed food around his plate and tried to think about the talent show instead, about the poem he'd been working on, about the possibility of finally being heard. "Actually," Daniel said quietly, his voice cutting through the conversation, "I signed up for the school talent show." The table fell silent. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward him with expressions ranging from surprise to something approaching horror. "You did what?" Sarah's voice was sharp with disbelief. "The talent show. I'm going to audition." Daniel's voice gained strength as he spoke. "I want to perform one of my poems." "Danny, sweetie," their mother said carefully. "Are you sure that's a good idea? I mean, being on stage in front of all those people?" "I'll be fine, Mom. I've been practicing." Sarah let out a laugh that was anything but amused. "Practicing? Danny, this isn't like reading an English class. This is in front of the whole school. What if you freeze up? What if you can't get the words out? What if people laugh?" Daniel finished for her, meeting her eyes directly for the first time in months. "What if they think I'm weird or broken or not worth listening to?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Their father cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Maybe we should support Daniel in whatever he wants to do." "Support him?" Sarah's voice rose. "Dad, you don't understand what school is like. If he gets up there and humiliates himself, it doesn't just affect him. People will talk. They'll remember. And I'm the one who has to deal with the fallout." "The fallout of what?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Of being related to you." The words burst out of Sarah before she could stop them, hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. The silence that followed was deafening. Their mother's face went pale, their father's jaw tightened, and Daniel felt something inside his chest crack open. Sarah Elizabeth Henderson. Their mother's voice was deadly quiet. Apologize to your brother right now. But Sarah was past the point of backing down. No, Mom. I'm sorry, but no. Do you have any idea what it's like to be Daniel Henderson's sister at school? Do you know how many times people ask me what's wrong with him, or if it's contagious, or if I'm embarrassed? And now he wants to get up on stage and make it 10 times worse? There's nothing wrong with me, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, there is, Sarah shot back. And pretending there isn't doesn't help anyone. You walk funny, you talk funny, you can't do half the things other kids can do, and now you want to get up in front of everyone and read poetry? It's going to be a disaster, and I'm going to be the one who has to live with it. That's enough. Their father's voice cut through Sarah's tirade like a blade. Go to your room, now. Fine, Sarah said, throwing her napkin down on her plate. But don't say I didn't warn you when this whole thing blows up in everyone's faces. She stormed out, leaving Daniel sitting at the table with tears threatening to spill over. He'd known Sarah was ashamed of him, but hearing it stated so baldly, so cruelly, felt like a physical blow. Danny, his mother said softly, reaching for his hand. You know she doesn't mean that, right? She's a teenager. She doesn't understand. But Daniel pulled his hand away and stood up from the table. She means it, Mom, and she's probably right. Maybe I shouldn't do the talent show. No, his father said firmly. Don't let your sister's fear stop you from doing something you want to do. If you want to perform, then you should perform. Daniel looked at his parents, really looked at them, and saw the pity in their eyes. They wanted to support him, he knew that, but they also thought Sarah might be right. They were terrified that he would embarrass himself, that people would laugh, that their broken son would become even more of a spectacle than he already was. I'm going to do it anyway, Daniel said quietly. I'm going to audition, and I'm going to perform my poem, and if people laugh, then at least I'll know I tried. He left the table and went to his room, closing the door softly behind him. He could hear his parents talking in hushed voices in the kitchen, probably discussing how to handle their difficult son and his impossible dreams. But Daniel didn't care anymore. He pulled out his notebook, the one filled with all his secret poems, and began to write. The auditions were held on a Thursday afternoon in the school auditorium. Daniel had spent weeks preparing, memorizing his poem until he could recite it in his sleep, practicing his delivery until the words flowed as smoothly as his damaged speech would allow. He arrived early, hoping to avoid the crowds of students who would undoubtedly be there to support their friends or mock the less talented. The auditorium was mostly empty when he slipped inside, just a few other nervous performers scattered among the seats. Mrs. Rodriguez was on stage with her clipboard, checking the lighting and sound equipment. When she saw Daniel, she smiled and waved him over. Daniel, I was hoping you'd try out. I've seen you practicing in here after school. You have? Of course, and I have to say, your dedication is impressive. What are you planning to perform? A poem, one I wrote myself. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyebrows rose. Original work? That's wonderful. Would you like to do a quick sound check? Daniel nodded and followed her onto the stage. The microphone stood in the center like a silver sentinel, and for a moment, he felt a flutter of panic. But then he looked out into the empty auditorium and remembered all the times he'd stood here alone, dreaming of this moment. Whenever you're ready, Mrs. Rodriguez said. Daniel approached the microphone, adjusted it to his height, and began. My name is Daniel Henderson, and I'm going to read a poem called Invisible. His voice echoed through the empty space, clear and strong. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded encouragingly, and Daniel felt his confidence grow. The poem was about feeling unseen, about being dismissed and overlooked, but it was also about finding strength in that invisibility, about the power of quiet observation, about the dreams that flourish in the shadows. His voice gained power as he read, the words flowing with a rhythm and musicality that transformed his usual halting speech into something approaching song. When he finished, Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Then she began to clap, slowly at first, then with genuine enthusiasm. "Daniel, that was beautiful. Really, truly beautiful. I had no idea you were such a talented writer." "Thank you. Listen, I want you to know that whatever happens in the actual show, what you just did up there was real artistry. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Daniel nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Someone had listened to his words, really listened, and found them worthy. Other students began filtering in for their auditions, and Daniel made his way to a seat in the back to watch. He recognized most of them. The popular kids with their polished song and dance numbers, the athletes showing off their physical prowess, the musicians with their practiced pieces. And then Sarah walked in. She spotted him immediately and made her way over, her expression unreadable. "Danny, what are you doing here?" "I'm auditioning, like I said I would. I thought, after our conversation at dinner, I thought maybe you'd changed your mind." "You mean after you told me I was an embarrassment?" Sarah's face flushed. "I didn't say that exactly." "You didn't have to say it exactly." She sat down beside him, an awkward gesture that surprised them both. "Look, Danny, I know I haven't been the best sister lately." "Lately?" "Okay, for a long time. But it's not because I don't love you, it's just high school is really hard, and people can be really cruel, and I guess I thought if I kept my distance, it would protect both of us." Daniel studied his sister's profile. She looked smaller somehow, younger, and for a moment he caught a glimpse of the girl who used to build blanket forts with him when they were little. "Protect us from what?" "From them seeing you as different and me as the girl with the weird brother. From the questions and the stares and the pity." She turned to look at him directly. "I know it's selfish. I know it's wrong. But I'm 17, Danny. I don't know how to be noble yet." It was the most honest thing Sarah had said to him in years, and Daniel felt some of his anger begin to soften. "I'm still going to do it," he said, "even if you don't want me to." "I know." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "What's your poem about?" "Being invisible." She winced. "Danny, it's not what you think. It's not a pity party. It's about finding power and being overlooked, about the things you see when people think you're not worth noticing." Sarah considered this. Will you let me hear it sometime?" "You can hear it at the talent show, if you want to come." "I'll be there," she said, and something in her voice made Daniel believe her. The auditions proceeded quickly. Mrs. Rodriguez called names from her list, students performed their pieces, and decisions were made on the spot. Daniel watched singer after singer, dancer after dancer, comedian after comedian take the stage. Most were competent, some were genuinely talented, and a few were disasters that made the audience cringe in sympathetic embarrassment. Finally, his name was called. Daniel Henderson. He made his way down to the stage, very aware of the eyes following his uneven gait. He could hear whispers from some of the other students, though he couldn't make out the words. His hands were shaking slightly as he approached the microphone, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "My name is Daniel Henderson, and I'm going to read an original poem called Invisible." And then he began. The words poured out of him like water from a broken dam. 3 years of silence and observation and longing transformed into language that painted pictures in the air. He spoke of being the shadow in the corner, the afterthought in family photos, the person others looked through rather than at. But he also spoke of the secret strength that came from that position, the way invisible people could see truth that the visible missed, the way quiet voices could carry farther than loud ones when they finally chose to speak. The auditorium fell silent as he read. Students who had been checking their phones or chatting with friends turned their attention to the stage. Mrs. Rodriguez stood perfectly still, her clipboard forgotten in her hands. Daniel's voice grew stronger as he continued, his natural speech patterns smoothing out in the rhythm of his words. He wasn't performing the poem so much as living it, embodying every line, every metaphor, every hard-won truth. When he finished, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Daniel stood at the microphone, suddenly aware of how exposed he was, how vulnerable he'd made himself. Then someone began to clap. It was slow at first, measured, but it built gradually until the entire auditorium was applauding. Not the polite, obligatory applause that had greeted most of the other performers, but something deeper, more genuine. "Thank you, Daniel," Mrs. Rodriguez said when the applause died down. "That was exceptional, truly exceptional. You're definitely in the show." Daniel nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, and made his way back to his seat. Sarah was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or something approaching respect. "Danny," she said quietly as he sat down, "that was..." "What? I had no idea you could write like that." "You never asked." She was quiet for the rest of the auditions, and when they were over, she walked with him toward the school exit. It was the first time in years that they'd walked together anywhere, and Daniel felt simultaneously hopeful and wary. "Danny," Sarah said as they reached the parking lot where their mother was waiting to pick them up. "About what I said at dinner the other night." "Which part?" "All of it, but especially the part about there being something wrong with you." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "There's nothing wrong with you. Different isn't wrong. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure that out." It wasn't a complete apology. There were still years of cruelty to account for, years of being ignored and dismissed and treated as an embarrassment. But it was a beginning, and Daniel had learned to value beginnings. "Thanks," he said simply. "Are you nervous about the show?" "Terrified," Daniel admitted. "Good. That means it matters to you." They got in the car, and their mother peppered them with questions about the auditions. Sarah let Daniel tell the story, only adding encouraging details when he left them out. It was a small kindness, but Daniel noticed it and filed it away with all the other small kindnesses he'd learned to treasure. The weeks leading up to the talent show passed in a blur of preparation. Daniel refined his poem, worked with Mrs. Rodriguez on his stage presence, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that he would soon be standing in front of most of his school, exposing his deepest thoughts and feelings to people who had spent years treating him as if he were invisible. The irony wasn't lost on him that his poem about invisibility would be his attempt to finally be seen. Sarah's attitude toward him continued to evolve during those weeks. She didn't suddenly become a perfect sister. Years of ingrained behavior don't change overnight. But she stopped actively avoiding him. She began including him in conversations at home, asking his opinion on things that mattered to her, treating him more like a brother and less like an inconvenient fact of life. It was progress, and Daniel tried to be grateful for it without expecting too much too quickly. The night of the talent show arrived with all the pageantry the school could muster. The auditorium was packed, families filling the seats while students paced nervously backstage. The energy was electric. That particular combination of excitement and terror that comes with live performance. Daniel stood in the wings, watching the other acts perform. The singers were polished, the dancers were energetic, the comedians got their laughs. The audience was engaged and supportive, applauding enthusiastically for each performance. But Daniel could see in their faces that they were waiting for something more, something that would surprise them, move them, make the evening memorable. He hoped desperately that his poem could be that thing, while simultaneously terrifying himself with visions of failure. "Daniel Henderson, you're up next," the stage manager whispered. His heart hammered against his ribs as he made his way to the side of the stage. Through a gap in the curtain, he could see his parents in the third row, his father adjusting his camera, his mother clutching her purse with nervous hands. Sarah sat beside them, leaning forward slightly, her face tight with what might have been concern or anticipation. The student before him finished his magic act to enthusiastic applause and bounded off stage with a grin. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at Daniel's elbow. "You ready?" "No," Daniel said honestly. "Good. The best performances come from that place of not being ready, of having to reach beyond yourself to make it work." She squeezed his shoulder and stepped away as the student announcer took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Daniel Henderson performing an original poem, Invisible." The applause was polite but scattered. Daniel could almost hear the collective thought of the audience. "Who? Oh, right, that disabled kid. This should be interesting." He walked onto the stage, his uneven gait more pronounced under the bright lights and the weight of hundreds of watching eyes. The microphone seemed impossibly far away, and he was sure everyone could see his hands shaking. But then he reached the center of the stage, looked out into the audience, and something shifted. These people, his classmates, their families, his teachers, his own family, they were all here, all watching, all waiting to hear what he had to say. For the first time in his life, Daniel had their complete attention. He would not waste it. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "My name is Daniel Henderson, and I want to share something with you that I've never shared with anyone before." The audience settled into their seats, the chatter dying away to expectant silence. "This is a poem I wrote called Invisible. But before I read it, I want you to know that it's not about being sorry for myself. It's about all the things I've learned from being the person others don't see, don't notice, don't think about. It's about the view from the shadows and the power that comes from being underestimated." He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the audience. He found his parents, found Sarah, found Mrs. Rodriguez standing in the wings with an encouraging smile. And then he began. "I am the whisper you don't quite hear, the shadow that falls when no light is near. I am the student who sits in the back, the one that your memory always lacks. I walk through your hallways like morning mist, barely there, easily missed. You speak around me, through me, past me, as if my presence were just fantasy. But invisible doesn't mean I'm not here, doesn't mean I don't see, don't feel, don't hear. From my place in the margins, the corners, the spaces, between your conversations, I study your faces. I see the girl who pretends she's fine, while her world falls apart, line by line. I see the boy who acts tough and mean to hide the scared child he's always been. I see the teacher who stays late each night, grading papers by fluorescent light, not for the paycheck or praise from above, but because teaching children is what she calls love. From the shadows, I watch you all play the complicated games you play every day, pretending to be what you think you should be, while forgetting the person you're meant to be. But I know who you are when you think no one's looking, when your mask slips and your real self comes booking through the cracks in your armor, the holes in your wall. And you're beautiful then, beautiful and small and real. I am invisible, yes, but I am here, carrying the weight of what I see and hear. And maybe, just maybe, if you stopped to look, you'd see me too, like a half-forgotten book sitting on the shelf of your peripheral vision, full of stories you've made some unconscious decision to ignore or dismiss or file away. But those stories matter. Those stories have something to say. So I step from the shadows, I speak from the dark, I offer my voice to light up the spark of recognition, connection, the bridge between your world and mine, the space in between. I am Daniel. I am here. I am seen. Not perfect, not whole, but absolutely real. And my invisibility has taught me to feel the weight of every moment, the gift of each day. The power of choosing what you want to say when everyone's finally ready to hear. the voice of someone they'd never considered dear. I am invisible, but I am not gone. I am the chorus you've been humming all along. And now that I've spoken, now that you know, maybe invisible is just another way to grow. The words hung in the air like music, each line building on the last, creating something larger than the sum of its parts. Daniel's voice had grown stronger with each stanza, his natural speech patterns disappearing entirely into the rhythm and flow of his poetry. The audience sat in complete silence. Hundreds of people held spellbound by the quiet boy they'd barely noticed before this moment. And then, somewhere in the middle of the auditorium, someone began to cry. It started as a quiet sniffle, but it spread like ripples in a pond. A mother in the front row wiped her eyes with a tissue. A teacher in the back row stood up to get a better look at this remarkable student she'd never really seen before. Daniel looked out at the audience and saw tears on faces throughout the crowd. Not tears of pity or embarrassment, but tears of recognition, of being truly seen and understood by someone they had overlooked. In the third row, his mother was openly weeping, her hand pressed to her mouth in amazement. His father had lowered his camera, too moved to remember to record the moment. And Sarah was staring at him with tears streaming down her face, her expression transformed by something that looked like wonder. The silence stretched on, thick with emotion and possibility, until someone in the back row began to clap. It was slow at first, measured and deliberate, but others joined in quickly. The applause built and built until the entire auditorium was on their feet, giving Daniel a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Daniel stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the response, hardly believing that these were the same people who had ignored him for years. But there they were, all of them, finally seeing him, finally hearing him, finally understanding that invisible didn't mean worthless. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared beside him on stage, her own eyes bright with tears. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone, "Daniel Henderson." The applause doubled, tripled, became a roar of appreciation and recognition that seemed to go on forever. When it finally died down and Daniel made his way off stage, he was immediately surrounded by classmates and teachers and parents he barely knew, all of them wanting to shake his hand, to tell him how moved they were, to say they'd never heard anything like it. But through the crowd, Daniel saw his family pushing toward him. His parents reached him first, enveloping him in a hug that lifted him off his feet. "Danny," his mother sobbed, "that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. I'm so proud of you. So proud." "Son," his father said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't have words. That was extraordinary." And then Sarah was there, standing just outside the family embrace, tears still wet on her cheeks. "Danny," she said when their parents finally released him. It's okay," Daniel said. "No, it's not okay. Nothing about how I've treated you has been okay." She stepped closer, her voice dropping so only he could hear. "That poem. You wrote that about me, didn't you? About all of us. Some of it. The part about the girl who pretends she's fine while her world falls apart?" Daniel nodded. "How did you know?" "Because I see you. Really see you. Even when you don't want to be seen." Sarah's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the little girl she'd been before high school, and social pressure had taught her to be cruel. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for making you feel invisible, for making you feel like you didn't matter. You matter, Danny. You matter so much, and I've been too scared and selfish to see it." She threw her arms around him then, holding him tightly while she cried into his shoulder. Daniel held her back, feeling years of hurt and anger begin to dissolve in the face of her genuine remorse. "I forgive you," he said quietly. "But Sarah, I need you to really see me from now on. Not just when I'm on stage, but every day. I need you to be my sister." "I will," she promised. "I swear I will." The rest of the talent show continued around them, but Daniel barely noticed. He was surrounded by people who wanted to talk to him, to know him, to hear more of his poetry. Teachers who had never given him a second thought were suddenly interested in his other writing. Classmates who had looked through him for years were introducing themselves as if meeting him for the first time. Which, in a way, they were. When the show ended and the awards were announced, Daniel won first place for Most Original Performance. He accepted the trophy with hands that shook only slightly, and when he looked out at the audience one more time, he saw hundreds of faces looking back at him, really looking at him, seeing him, acknowledging his existence in a way they never had before. On the drive home, the family was unusually quiet, each of them processing the evening in their own way. "Danny," their mother said finally, "why didn't you ever tell us you were such a talented writer?" "Would you have listened?" Daniel asked, not unkindly. The question hung in the air, uncomfortable in its honesty. "We're listening now," their father said. "All of us," Sarah added from beside him, "and not just tonight, but from now on. Really listening." Daniel looked out the car window at the familiar streets of his neighborhood, the same streets he'd walked with his uneven gait for years, feeling invisible and unimportant. But something fundamental had shifted tonight. He was still the same person with the same disability, but he was no longer invisible. He had found his voice, claimed his space, demanded to be seen. And for the first time in his life, people were actually looking. That night, as Daniel lay in bed clutching his first-place trophy, he thought about the poem he might write next. Maybe something about transformation, about the moment when the invisible becomes visible, when the silent find their voice, when the dismissed finally demand their due. Or maybe he'd write about forgiveness, about the complex love between siblings, about the way families can break apart and come back together, stronger for having been tested. He had so many stories to tell, so many words waiting to pour out of him. And now he knew that people would listen, that his voice mattered, that being different didn't mean being less than. Down the hall, he could hear Sarah on the phone with one of her friends, telling them about his performance, her voice full of pride and excitement. "You should have seen him," she was saying. "My little brother is amazing. Actually amazing. I can't wait for you to meet him properly." Daniel smiled in the darkness and began composing his next poem in his head, this one about the night his sister finally saw him, really saw him, and decided he was worth knowing after all. He was still invisible in many ways, still disabled, still different, still facing challenges that others would never have to consider. But invisible no longer meant worthless, no longer meant forgotten. Invisible, Daniel had learned, could also mean powerful. And he was ready to use that power to change the world, one poem at a time.